It's said that history is shaped by a billion tiny moments. The players involved, their hopes and dreams sometimes endure, but sometimes, maybe all too often, they are forgotten. In rooms like the one you are sitting in now, in attics and basements, quietly rest pieces of yesterday. This is the story of an impoverished Irish family tied together by a hard-working mother named Ellen Lambert Murphy, who would sacrifice and push her children to achieve more than she ever could, and the son who wished to honor her legacy. His name was Francis Parnell Murphy. In 1866, a young Irish Catholic couple appeared on the outskirts of Winchester. 24-year-old Civil War hero Patrick Murphy and his 17-year-old bride Ellen Lambert. Patrick Murphy had stepped off the boat on his own in America at just 14. Independent, quick-thinking, freedom-loving, and fully educated, Patrick had what many Irish immigrants did not at that time: the ability to read and write. He was also a skilled leather worker and had found work bouncing from tannery to tannery throughout New Hampshire and Vermont as a courier. He loved liberty as much as his heart soared when he read the words of Lincoln, and so when the call went up for the Green Mountain Boys to take arms he took. In the 2 years he spent with the Union Army, he would be decorated for his actions during the Battle of Cedar Creek and joining General Sherman on his famous March to the Sea. Returning home to Vermont after being mustered out of service in 1865, he would soon meet Ellen Lambert, by all accounts a bonny lass, born in Tipperary, Ireland on June 30th, 1849, a raven-haired, red-cheeked, lively Irishwoman who was quick to laugh, proud, ambitious, and self-sacrificing. Both Patrick and Ellen moved from Ireland to the United States at a time when immigrants were expected to quickly assimilate into American society. The problem is that they were Irish. During the Americanization movement, to be Irish was to be worse than a second-class citizen. To be Catholic was even worse. Anti-Irish sentiment ran deep in the old country and became so ingrained in the cultural consciousness of a people that it found root even in the New World. 19th century British xenophobia and the 1831 riots in Philadelphia only galvanized the anti-Irish movement, giving rise to "No Irish Need Apply," a common phrase to help wanted ads throughout America. Nonetheless, Patrick found steady work at the A.C. Lawrence Tannery on the east side of North Main Street in Winchester. The tannery operated from 1831 until it burned down in 1909. During this period, the Winchester Tannery site included bark piles, leach pits, a bark mill splitting, finishing rooms, and a tan yard. As a courier after the tanning process, he applied techniques of dressing, finishing, and coloring to the tan hide to make it strong, flexible, and waterproof. Patrick and Ellen found temporary housing in a cottage in Pond Village, now known as Lake Forest, a mile north of Winchester at the present address of 392 Keene Road. Patrick was making just $1.25 a day, which wasn't much, but it was home. On August 16, 1877, their fourth son was born. They named him Francis Parnell Murphy, after St. Francis of Assisi and Irish patriot Charles Stewart Parnell. It is perhaps ironic that these names would foretell much of what would become his character and causes in life: the deeply religious and dedicated charity virtues of St. Francis, and the fiery intelligence of politician Charles Stewart Parnell. In 1880, the growing family moved to a small farm under Manning Hill, the house that still stands today at 27 Manning Hill Road. While the prospects of farming offered the family the ability to support itself, the land itself was less than ideal. Rocky and barren, for the 7 years the family would live there, getting vegetables to grow would be a constant challenge. The house was crowded, but they were happy. Proud and independent, they took nothing and asked for nothing, relying on themselves alone. And everyone pitched in. As evidently poor as the Murphys were, it was all the more obvious in their children's lack of shoes, which during the summer was no big deal, as plenty of children ran around barefoot. But come October and then November, it was another matter altogether. The rule of the house was that shoes were only for church and after the first snow. At 7 years old, Francis and his dog Rover would wake before the crack of dawn, the frosted ground chilling his bare feet, and drive the cows up Manning Hill to pasture. The feeling of standing barefoot in that pasture, in the cold, would be a feeling Francis would never forget, and it got him thinking. By all accounts, the Murphy children were smart, and Francis was no different. They weren't given much choice in the matter, as Ellen was ambitious for her children to achieve, and never stopped pushing them to excel and learn how to solve problems themselves. One frosty October morning, 10-year-old Francis and his Newfoundland dog Rover had just finished herding the cows on the hill. On his way back into the warmth of the house, he stopped into the harness room on the farm. He sat down on the wooden bench and started to rub the life back into his feet. A pile of shingles in the corner caught his eye, and on a wooden peg over his head there were some straps of leather. Struck with inspiration, he selected 2 of the stoutest shingles and with his jackknife cut 2 soles to the shape of his feet. Next, with some of the more pliable strips of leather at hand, he made himself a pair of strap-on footwear. The first pair were crude, but by November he had corrected some of the defects of his handmade sandals, where he could almost endure much of the winter with his curious footwear. It's important to note that sandals as a concept didn't exist in the United States, and wouldn't until soldiers returned home from China and the Philippines after World War II. 62 years before they became the popular summer footwear, a cold, 10-year-old boy invented them in Winchester. All the Murphy children would attend the Winchester School, dashing home for lunch for Ellen's pork and beans and Johnny cake, and a tall glass of fresh milk before they would head back to school. On his way back, young Francis would pause outside one particular house, itself a landmark of Winchester. Set far back from the main street, up a maple-lined shady drive, was a large, old-fashioned colonial mansion, the home of Miss Jane Grace Alexander. Born on October 26, 1848 in Winchester, Jane was the daughter of Edward and Lucy Alexander. She had been educated locally and finished her courses in Glenwood Seminary in Brattleboro, Vermont. After returning home and teaching in Winchester for many years, she became interested in her father's business dealings. She became his bookkeeper and later managed his affairs. In 1871, she became a general assistant at the Winchester National Bank, and a year later became an assistant cashier, a position she would hold for 22 years. With a keen business mind and a mastery of numbers, she was elected treasurer of the Security Savings Bank of Winchester in 1881, only the second woman in the country at that time to hold such a position. Making considerable money at the time, she would continue to preserve and treasure the old family homestead throughout her life. She would pass away in 1932, and her beloved home with its hay-filled barn would sit quietly empty, but it was never forgotten by a little barefoot boy. While Miss Alexander was making a name for herself in banking, by 1887 the A.C. Lawrence Tannery was in trouble. With work being inconsistent day to day, the already struggling Murphys began looking for a better future for their family. Later that year, they would leave Winchester forever for steadier work in Hudson, Massachusetts. There, Francis would indulge his obsessions with shoes by getting work with the shoe factories there. By 1898, he would begin running the packing department for the Child Chamberlain Shoe Company in Newport, New Hampshire, where he would start a family of his own. In the span of 2 decades, he flourished in business, rising through the ranks of the McElwain Company after they bought out the Child Chamberlain Shoe Company. He became a self-made millionaire by 1921, and a year later formed a new company with J.F. McElwain, moving his family to Nashua and founding the J.F. McElwain Company. By the 1930s, they had become the largest employer in the state of New Hampshire, cranking out millions of shoes per year. While the McElwain name is mostly lost to time, the shoe brand that Francis and his partner created is not. Thom McAn. For all that personal growth, he never forgot his roots, becoming dedicated to community, charity, and civic duty. During the 1920s and 30s, he would become increasingly more involved in politics, serving on the Executive Council and as a state rep as a progressive liberal in the Republican Party. After being repeatedly asked by petition by the citizens, on March 27, 1935, Murphy announced his run for governor of New Hampshire. For the first time since his boyhood, his campaign tour returned him to Winchester on September 14, 1936. After a standing ovation in the town hall filled to capacity, longtime friend Reverend George T. Carl of the Federated Churches of Winchester introduced him. He would reminisce about his boyhood years and fond memories of the good times and the rough patches, and the strength of his mother, who had passed away 7 years previous. Following the event, the two would drive by the now vacant Alexander homestead, and Reverend Carl suggested the idea of a community center funded through a private nonprofit organization to honor Ellen Lambert Murphy. Francis loved the idea. The cold morning of November 3, 1936, broke to the news that Francis Parnell Murphy had been one of the few Republicans in the country to survive Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal sweep. He became the first Irish Catholic governor in United States history, and he quickly got to work on Reverend Carl's idea. In 1937, he purchased the 29-acre Alexander homestead, including the 11-room mansion, its remaining furnishings, and its barn, and began extensive renovations to create a $25,000 community center, almost all of which he personally funded, the equivalent of $500,000 in today's money. The barn was transformed into an auditorium. The house was freshened up and altered to house everyone from the American Legion to the Red Cross. On Monday, January 17, 1938, the Allen Lambert Murphy Community Center was dedicated, kicking off a week-long celebration. Hundreds of people attended in the cold, including every governor in New England. Surrounded by his family, Governor Murphy beamed out at the crowd as he handed the keys to President of the Trustees, John H. Dickinson. "This is one of the happiest days of my life, and one I shall never forget," he said. "For today, it is my good fortune to see realized, in the completion of this wonderful memorial to my mother, a hope that I have entertained for many years." Inside, hanging serenely in the front ladies' parlor, an oil portrait of Ellen Lambert Murphy, painted by Richmond K. Fletcher of Massachusetts, was hung to welcome all who visited. The large barn underwent the largest transformation, with a new stage added to the rear, with a beach scene mural painted along the back wall. Before it, taxidermist Luman Nelson would create a natural beach scene with real driftwood and mounted birds. During the week, dances and banquets were held and motion pictures were shown. An exhibit of 43 paintings from contemporary American painters was loaned to the center courtesy of the Guild Studio of New York City to bring in a sense of fine art and culture. Beginning that summer and throughout the remainder of his life, the town of Winchester would host an annual celebration for their famous son to celebrate his birthday. It also became a tradition for Murphy to unveil a new addition to the center, from a small pool one year to a new commercial kitchen, a gun range, and even bowling alleys. This yearly town-wide celebration would be called Murphy Days, after a bronze plaque was placed on August 16, 1941. In the decades that followed, the grounds became the focal point of the community, home to baseball games, concerts, and carnivals. Following a failed run for the Senate after 2 terms as governor, giving the state everything from the Cannon Mountain aerial tram to the state police force, Murphy left politics forever. He would create WMUR Radio, that lives on today as WGIR, and WMUR-TV, the station that still has his name as call letters. In 1957, Murphy was diagnosed with throat cancer. He would return to Winchester for the final time on August 19, 1957, the last celebration he would attend. Becoming crippled with sickness, he would spend the remaining months of his life confined to his home in Nashua. On December 19, 1958, he succumbed to his battle with cancer at the age of 81.
How I was born on a small farm in the little town of Winchester, the son of a Civil War soldier, a staunch Lincoln Republican. You all know that I started in life with nothing. All that I have done.
The passage of time erodes everything. Today, the man is largely forgotten. Photos fade, and within less than a generation, who a person is beyond a name and deed is lost. But if the truest and most lasting legacy is not what you leave behind, but the lives that you touch, the Ellen Lambert Murphy Memorial Community Center is that legacy. In its 80 years, children have found growth and families have spent precious time together. Generations of families have played on these grounds and laughed in these halls. It is the lasting legacy of a mother's strength, making sure her children were fed and as clothed as they could be, and that their prospect would always be better than hers. The legacy of the simple love a son had for his mother, and his hope that she would not be forgotten. It's also the story of the countless volunteers, trustees, and members over the years that have carried that torch. Its mission is as unchanged today as it was when Governor Francis Parnell Murphy stood on a cold January morning and spoke these words. I hereby dedicate these grounds, these buildings, to the encouragement of the eternally glorious arts of design, of music, of drama, and the practical handicraft, to the fostering of community ideals and community action, to the development of wholesome sports and recreation, to the dissemination of a spirit of neighborliness, of tolerance in opinions, of civil enterprise, and good citizenship.